Ready for coffee, baby. Breathing fuel.
So, like, I've heard that you're somewhat of a big deal in the prepper space. This is what I've heard. Is this like or is this just like propaganda? Is this just like false? Is this, what are the fake news? Or
No, based on the book Prepared that I wrote.
You wrote a book
on the subject matter
called Prepared.
There's a friend of yours named Evan that I wrote it to.
Okay.
Evan's got a copy. You should get it from him.
And it's called Prepared.
It's called Prepared.
Prepared.
A manual
Interesting.
for surviving worst case scenarios.
Interesting. So if you're a guy that is a subject matter expert with your background, because I've also heard that you're at the FBI or ATF or something like that, where you...
The DEA. No, the Central Intelligence Organization.
So what's going on right now in Florida is obviously like it's weighing heavily, I think, on the national conscience. And when I say conscious, I should say, because we're thinking about these natural disasters, where are they happening? They're impacting people in our country, and our families, our friends, and people are directly impacted by this. So we got to talk about it. Like, how do you prepare for this?
Yeah, Florida is an exception, I would say, when you're comparing like Hurricane Milton, for example, to Hurricane Helene. Milton is scheduled, by the time you see this, it had already devastated Florida at a Category 4 1 day from impacting Tampa Bay. Now, what's unique about it is it's supposed to bring 12 foot at a minimum storm surges,
right,
which is very unique to hurricanes on the West Coast, in the Gulf. And the last time that's happened is nearly 100 years ago.
Seriously.
Yeah. So that particular path is very unique, despite the non-uniqueness of Florida getting devastated by hurricanes constantly, because they're in their path. They're obviously in a peninsula. They are prepared. And so they have the mechanisms of being prepared. And the analogy I'll use, and you'll get this, it's like the equivalent of like an oil and gas guy who works oil and gas fields in rural Texas or in Montana or in Idaho versus an urbanite who doesn't have any concept of this idea of preparedness. You get in a pickup truck and drive in rural, let's say northern Montana beyond Coeur d'Alene, and you are rolling from Idaho to Montana into no man's land where you're going to have 75 gallons minimum of a tank of auxiliary fuel. There are things that people think about in that environment that Florida's thinking about that the Appalachians never thought about. I mean, the one reason the Appalachians were so grossly affected, which is the same place that I grew up. I mean, I grew up visiting Chimney Rock every year with my family because it's like the poor man's vacation. We couldn't afford to go to Disney World in Florida, but we could afford to go west to Dolly World and Chimney Rock. All the rain poured into the mountains and basically act as a gutter drain, draining down into the valleys, and created a massive devastation of flooding, which is recorded at a minimum of 30 inches of flooding, which obviously rose the levels of the rivers and streams, which wiped entire towns off the map.
Well, it's insane.
Radical, insane, crazy.
Yeah. So from a Floridian that's outside of what I would say is the hurricane belt, they're going to see wind, rain. They're going to see obviously a big storm. But what you're really referencing is like people are already prepared, and if they haven't prepared for something like this, then they're probably leaving the state. So how many people do you think like leave the state because of this? Like,
well, there's been DeSantis. There's a whole bunch of synergy and integration that's happening. One, because of good leadership, and the example I'll give you, because I thought about this last night when kind of looking at what was going on with the hurricane right now. Right now, it's like being on patrol.
Yeah.
And we're playing like Ranger School games where, this random person in the squad is now the platoon leader or the platoon sergeant. And if they're not a clear, concise leader, you're going to feel that. You're going to be in the patrol base holding a rifle, staring into the wood line on doing your security and asking like, what are we doing? Or you're going to be sitting in the barracks waiting on the word. Like we're like, what is happening right now? That is the feeling that's happening in Hurricane Helene. I know that because Tim Kennedy was giving me some feedback on the ground at the lack of command and coordination. When you don't have that, the feeling is like feeling like a Joe on the outer perimeter of a patrol base,
right?
Where you don't know what's going on. Nobody's told you anything, and you just play PlayStation in the barracks until you figure out what's going on because you're just waiting on the word. When you're informed, it gives you a sense of confidence that the people above you or the people around you have your best interest at heart. That's the problem with this as comparing it to Milton in Florida. They have a good relationship with FEMA. The synergy between state and the feds, because a lot of the federal annexing of emergency responders, for example, are utilizing local assets. So it's like the JTTF. Like a police officer in a local community will be tasked and dual-rolled in being a police officer, but also a federal officer for Joint Terrorism Task Force when it's needed. That kind of synergy is being used or utilized in Florida, where firefighters and police officers are being leveraged, and they're basically being co-opted in a good agreement and helping the community because of good leadership. And so they're squared away. There are mandatory evacuations right now in Florida, which is pretty rare. For them to say that we're going to mandatorily evacuate you in Florida is pretty rare. You could opt, despite the mandatory evacuation, to stay. But as the mayor, I believe, of Tampa put out, you're going to die.
Oh, really?
She said, basically, you're going to die. That's the reality. Wow. So make sure, she said this, and I appreciate her candor. She said, write your name with a Sharpie on your arm. So when we find you, we can identify you. Dude. But that's like the harsh shit.
Reality of like, I don't think people quite literally understand when the force of nature, which means like you're re-injected out of this artificial safety reality that Americans typically live in, and you're re-injected into the reality of physics and nature, it will fucking kill you. Zero. Like it's not as if it plays out like in the movies where, oh my gosh, come back to life, or like you get a second chance. No, man. Like it's just, you're just dead or injured, which I think is really interesting for some people to be like smacked in the face with reality. Like write your name with a Sharpie on your arm because you're going to die. Yep. That had to have like shook some people awake.
Yeah. When you look at Hurricane Helene and its impact, especially in North Carolina, it's impacted basically every state up the Gulf, which is Florida, South Carolina, Tennessee, and North Carolina. When you look at the devastation in North Carolina, the water was bending steel beams used to support bridges in half. And if you were caught up in that water and that flood, there's no chance of survival. You know this as a river guide. Yeah. There's zero chance of survival because it's a monstrosity of fierce physics that there is no coming back from. And so I appreciate the candor, and I'm also slightly disappointed by the things that I'm hearing out of North Carolina specifically, because there are a whole bunch of things coming out of it. I just saw the corporate media this morning justifying those actions and saying a lot of it was misinformation, which is completely a lie. Because when you look at the people who are on the ground who are reporting on it, YouTubers, influencers, and media, these people are doing the real journalism that no journalist in corporate media is doing. Why isn't ABC, NBC, CNN, Fox on the ground reporting whatever their nightly David Muir news show from the grounds of Ground Zero at the most devastating hurricane in the last 50 and likely going to be the last 100 years? Like, why would they not be doing that? Well, there's a disinterest in it, because if they're reporting on the facts or what's going on the ground, it makes the administration look bad. Because, VP Harris is showing up days after Trump. Trump showed up in Georgia. She's not showing up at all. And then all of this idea that FEMA's not doing their job, they could say, no, they're doing their job. It's a lie. Glenn Beck just reported on this. He walked around and was like, I couldn't find anybody from FEMA. And the one guy I found, he talked to the manager and said, why aren't you available where people can find you? He said, well, that's not really our job. We're kind of off the beaten path. It's like, well, then what are you doing? And it just gets back to the basics of it, which I think this is the full circle lesson learned in this. I'll be talking about this on my show on Prepared on my YouTube channel at Mike Glover Actual. But the reality is, stop having a mismanaged expectation that the government's going to bail you out. We figured that out early on in the military.
Right.
The government, interagency organizations that call at 2 a.m. into the fire base, your fire base is going to be attacked in an hour and then hanging up. Nobody's going to come to save you. You have to save yourself. That's what's happening organically. And I think people continue to say, well, it looks like Americans are taken care of. It's like, that should be the SOP. Stop depending and leaning on the government to bail you out. And what that means is, don't be reactive. Actually have a plan. Actually know your neighbors. Be squared away. Make sure your family's integrated into a preparedness plan yourself. And we won't have to be talking about you potentially being a casualty.
Well, it's always interesting to me to hear from people that their expectation for their first line of defense, their first option is the government. And
wild.
It's a wild mentality, because it's a forfeiture of accountability in a way that says, I don't have to take responsibility for my safety or my family's safety. I'm going to rely on a taxpayer initiative, which, by the way, what I always like to refer to is like, it's a one size fits all shoe. So yeah, if you're a 10, it fits great, but any size outside of a 10, it doesn't fit great. And this expectation that everybody's going to get equal care and or emergency care that's going to go above and beyond what you could quite possibly build with just making a few phone calls and building a plan, just being organized with your community. We've seen this now over the course of the last 4 years. Let's just, go back to, I was kind of like, draw this line in the sand with like pre-COVID, post-COVID, right? Okay, if COVID taught us anything, I hope at this point in our lives, that national or federal and local governments that directly shut down our government, that misrepresented facts, that continued to like blow up our fucking economies, they had no clue what they were doing. More importantly, it directly impacted our liberty. Like, we forfeited our liberty to somebody that either knew less than we did and or didn't have all the facts in order to put together a proper plan to make safe our businesses, to make safe our families. And now what we're supposed to do is say, but this time it's going to be different, baby. The taxpayer, from the United States perspective, this is my 2 cents, it's almost like we're in a domestic violence situation where, sorry, it's like it's like, no, man, like the Fed has just been beating up the taxpayer all the time, but this time it's going to be different. But this time it's going to be different. Yep. But this time, hey, you know what? I know we invaded Iraq under false pretenses. There weren't any weapons of mass destruction. We spent 2 decades in war. And I know that we withdrew out of Afghanistan and gave the Taliban billions of dollars worth of equipment. And, I know that we completely fucked up COVID, and I know, but this time it's going to be different. Mm-hmm. We're going to be really AJ squared away this time, because all we need is more of your money, and we're going to make it. We're going to make it right this time. It's like, but all we need is just more of your money. If we continue to witness the large-scale transference of wealth between the taxpayer and what I would say any industrial complex, meaning military industrial complex, the homeless industrial complex, the pharmaceutical industrial complex, all we're doing is we're continuing to watch this slow motion car wreck over and over and over again. And then we're forfeiting our ability to maintain our national sovereignty, our individual sovereignty, I should say, not our national sovereignty. And it winds me up, man. I'm like, when are you guys going to learn? I just want to look around and go, when are you guys going to learn? I'm not saying that there's a need to eliminate all government services. That's not what I'm saying whatsoever. I'm not a true libertarian in that regard. I'm saying we cannot continue to be duped by the political rhetoric that is directly misrepresenting what the future holds us based on a political base previous fact pattern. How many trillions of dollars? $34 trillion in debt right now
34.
because of misrepresentation and spending.
Yep.
And now all of a sudden it's going to be different this time, Mike. You know what? Just got to reelect them again for 4 more years, but they're going to do their jobs this time. So I know that they've had the last 4, but this time it's going to be different, baby.
Yeah, it's asinine, and we do it to ourselves. I mean, this country's very good at doing it to ourselves. When you look at, I've already navigated kind of leftist tactics, and we've talked about this before. They own the media. They own the narrative. And what you see now is just complete and utter lying to the American people.
They don't care.
And what's sickening about that is half the country knows. And that's why we lean on platforms like X and First Amendment and all these liberties that we've lost and getting back a sense of semblance of what it should look like. At the same time, we're spending $150 million plus, because we actually spent $200+ million on humanitarian aid for Lebanese people.
Right.
Like, I get it. Like, the poor people of Lebanon, it's tragic what's happening. But the fallout from the collateral damage is because they're bombing Hezbollah commanders who are terrorists, right? At the same time that we're spending $600 in one go, in one round, in 1 year, $650 million on illegals, mostly illegal immigrants, and their housing from a pot of funds and from FEMA. And the White House will say, because they'll lie to your face, oh, that's not from that pot of funds. It's from FEMA. Their ability to cross over funds is a congressional hearing in about 10 minutes. It's done all the time. That line of funding could be leveraged and utilized as it was fluid for helping illegal immigrants, because that wasn't the intent. We're $1 billion in 2 years, about a year and a half, of national spending out of FEMA's budget for just that, where Mayorkas is now coming out saying, hey, man, sorry, we're out of money. And then Biden's saying to the press, the national press, hey, guys, we need to raise money for the victims of Helene. What are you talking about? You just tweeted, your VP just tweeted that you're going to spend $150 million on humanitarian aid for the people of Lebanon. That's not Lebanon, Pennsylvania. That's not Lebanon, North Carolina.
Not to be confused with Lebanon, Pennsylvania.
That's literally the country, and you're saying it in the middle of a crisis that Americans are going through. But what drives me crazy is the rhetoric, the narrative. They buy into it, and so it frustrates me because you have like one billionaire, maybe 2, call Trump, put Trump in that pot with Elon Musk, that get it and putting their money where their mouth is. But you don't have a lot of them stepping up and saying, hey, man, how do we gain control of the media? How do we reestablish trust and start communicating what's really going on? Man, I spend some time on Facebook Marketplace. I don't have a Facebook account. I have a ghost account, which is funny because if you're trying to buy stuff on Facebook Marketplace and you have a ghost account, nobody believes you're real.
Yeah, you're like,
it's wild.
Do you talk in an accent?
And sometimes,
yeah.
Because if I do, I actually did it Mike Glover, and I had a guy that I was going to buy like a jerry can from my Land Cruiser, and he said, "You're a scammer," and I'm like, "For what? What are you talking about?" He's like, "You're not Mike Glover." I'm like, No, I am. And he deleted and blocked me. And I couldn't buy a $25 jerry can in my hometown.
That was me. I did that because I was like, this is a Mike Glover. I was listening to this clip on so it was Elon and Don Lemon, that like idiot CNN host or whoever, MSNBC, CNN. I don't really care. Yeah. And they were in this debate over censorship. And Elon was talking about how if you want moderation, if you want to moderate a platform, if it's not illegal rhetoric, the First Amendment protects it. And you should have the ability to disagree and say what you want. And he was like, well, but you're responsible, for radicalizing and things like that. He's like, I'm not. It's not illegal. What you want to do is you want to hide behind this moderating a platform, which is essentially propaganda and a narrative for censorship. That's what you're doing. Whereas I'm just putting things out or allowing people to communicate through freedom of speech. If it's illegal, that's when it doesn't go on. If it's legal, it can stay up. It's the way it works, dude. And it was so funny because he referenced, he's like, but what about child pornography? I'm like, this guy is an idiot. it's illegal. And that's what he's like, just kind of stopped. He's like, yeah, that's illegal. It can't go up. Like,
that's the line.
What are you talking about? Like, they don't even understand what the difference is between, illegal, which is a collective of constitutional guidelines that say what we can or can't do.
It's against the law.
It's against the law. He doesn't even understand that. So there's this group of people that are constantly trying to limit the way that we talk because they don't like who we are. They don't like who we are. At the end of the day, I really do feel like this cultural division between these two pieces of America are about who I'll say is the educated elite, right? The people that really believe they're smarter than everybody else.
Yeah.
Now, the educated elite, typically, they have no tangible skill set, by the way. They can't change a tire.
Yeah.
Like their reality, their reality is not based in actual, like, injecting themselves into the actual natural order of things. They're protected in high density urban populations, in apartment buildings and things like this. When I'm like overgeneralizing, and granted, it's a highly caffeinated rant, but they have been indoctrinated by the universities in this country to truly believing that they are smarter. They have a higher IQ. And there's a difference, because I know plenty of electricians and plumbers and pipe fitters and welders that have really high IQs that could just demolish a guy with a master's degree or a PhD in just general life. But they can't regurgitate a obscure French philosopher from 1812. And it's like they have somehow confused their increase of debt and education with intelligence. They have somehow completely missed the mark. And we saw this too. I think I see it sometimes in social media across the board, where you have given a pundit, an anchor, the ability to communicate. And essentially all you're doing is reading a teleprompter. But they have zero life experience. And they're just reading a teleprompter. Typically, if they're just reading a teleprompter, all they're doing is just regurgitating information that has been fed to them. And they're somehow going out and pretending as if they're subject matter experts on that subject. They're not.
No.
And they're wanting to debate a guy that has built companies that are self-landing rockets, like going out into space and then coming back. And somehow they feel like they have a place at the table to have an educated or IQ-based debate around freedom of speech, when ultimately all they are is they're regurgitating information.
That's it.
They're just a fucking mouth-breathing, talking head, teleprompting reading idiot. I mean, look at that, like, dumpy potato-looking Svelter or whatever.
Oh, my God.
What is that guy? Like,
he's back on CNN.
Oh, of course he is. Of course he is.
Gross. That dude's gross.
It's like listening to bureaucrats about protecting yourself and your family is like listening to obese people tell you how to protect your health.
Yeah.
It truly is.
Yeah.
It's like they don't know. You're not going to go to a person that is extremely unhealthy. It's that whole thing of like going to the doctor, and if your doctor is obese smoking cigarettes, are you really going to listen to that doctor?
Hey, yeah.
No. He has no clue. He's not actually a subject matter expert. He's just a doctor, and who knows what he's actually doing.
The JD Vance
What
debate.
What a great debate.
Yeah, what
a great debate.
It was amazing. I mean, it shows you the difference in the skill set, and also understanding subject matter of the real policies and what's going on in the world, versus a dude who's just kind of flapping his gums.
Did you see that Tiananmen Square tap dance that dude did for like 20 minutes? And it was so ridiculous because he starts and he's like, it's like, well, you, and I forget the exact question, but if you haven't seen it, go pull the clip because it is hilarious, where he talks, where he's asked, like, you said that you were in Tiananmen Square. However, we pulled your travel records and you weren't actually there. And then he starts with saying, well, I grew up in Nebraska. I used to ride a bike and, like I look at corn, and he's like going around. I'm like, this is a perfect example of a guy just getting caught red-handed on the national stage. And now he's going in, he's putting his tap dancing shoes on, going clickety-clack, clickety-clack. Don't look at me. Like, don't listen to the words that I'm saying.
Yeah.
Like, just get completely distracted. And they did a good job. I think they and I'm not saying the entire thing was good. I'm saying they asked him again. They're like, that's great. You grew up in Nebraska.
That's not what we asked.
You had a tire swing in the front yard and your uncle was a good dude, but were you there? And he's like, well, I was there around that same time. Instead of just saying, hey, you know what? I misspoke, or, I take accountability for my actions right here in the national stage. Like, can you imagine a politician be like, you know what? I take accountability for my actions right now, today. You know what? I messed up.
I made a mistake.
But they can't say that. I actually think they would gain more support by just like being transparent. Because they would say, just own it. Just be honest. Just go, you know what? I fucked up.
Yeah.
Like, sorry.
Yeah.
You know what? Everybody does it. Fucked up.
I wasn't a command sergeant major. I never was in Iraq.
I was never in war. Never carried a rifle really in war. So I can't really speak on the Second Amendment.
I wasn't
anyway.
active duty. I was in the
wasn't on
Guard.
active duty. Like, I was never like, if you just like own all of it, be like, I've been on the taxpayer payroll my entire life and I know nothing else. And all I'm trying to do is consolidate more power and continue to grow my personal wealth based on taxpayers. Like, if he would just say that.
That's the reality.
Maybe he would like gain a little bit more respect.
That's really what's going on. And then the Kamala Harris, I actually appreciated the 60 Minutes interview they did because he was pressing her, especially
I didn't see it. Was it good?
It was good because, that guy, I can't remember the dude's name. He's a black dude and he's a good guy. He was not letting her get away. Even when she was slipping, he would bring it back and be like, that's not what I said.
Are you serious?
Dude, he was going after her. And there's a clip where they focus in on immigration. And he says, look, the numbers tripled under your administration of people, illegals coming over. And she started to tap dance and not answering the question, nothing direct. And he's like, but that's not what I said. I said, you guys' numbers tripled. They tripled. Like, and you're denying that. Like, and she again tap danced and she goes, well, I just don't agree. And it's like, okay, you could not agree all you want in your head and just make things up. She was asked on The View, hey, what's different between you
I saw that.
and Biden?
She's like,
nothing. And she says, well, nothing comes to mind. How does nothing come to mind when you're asked after being nearly in the White House for 4 years, what's the difference between your new campaigning to be president of the United States and your experience under the campaign as the VP with Biden? And nothing comes to mind. Well, nothing comes to mind because you're just not that intelligent.
No.
Her teleprompter, did you see this clip where her teleprompter went out and she'd repeated the same thing just like 10 times? She was just waiting for the teleprompter to kick back in.
It's so interesting. I love politics to me. I mean, some people like it, some people don't, but politics to me is so interesting because, I just got devoured a few years ago because I donated to Tulsi's campaign when she was a Democrat. And I was like, because I follow politics. I love it. And Tulsi's a friend of mine, and she was holding Hillary Clinton accountable on the debate stage.
Yeah.
Like, she was the only Democrat doing so. In the national debate stage, she was talking about the Clinton war machine on a regular cycle. So I'm like, yeah, man. Like, if you don't think I want to put another coin in that jukebox, you're crazy. Like, and by the way, look at her now.
Yeah.
Look at her now. It's like Tulsi
Hopefully she's like the sec def.
Seriously, dude.
Yeah.
And which frustrates me with conservatives at times because I'm like, hey, guys, this needs to be a big tent full of a bunch of people that honestly, if they're going to be in this purity test where, and actually Junior and I, and this isn't me name dropping, but Don Jr. and I were talking about this over the weekend. He was here hunting moose in northern Utah. We had lunch and we were talking about how, people criticize like the RFK decision and people have criticized, the
even Elon.
Tulsi and Elon. It's like, but if you're not inclusive, and I'm not mean that from like the local,
DEI.
I don't mean that. I mean, if you're not trying to include people that can change their mind, right? And if you're trying to push people and ostracize them because they don't pass a purity test because they might have been, a Democrat 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, dude, that's insane. Like, you have to collect people based on the movement of a political ideology and the way that it looks now and in the future, not based on what it's done in the last, 50 years, because the Democrats of, 20, 30 years ago, dude, a Democrat from like 30 years ago would be considered a Republican today, 100%. Because what were they? Anti-war, right? They were like, and if we were like to flip the switch and go back and it's like, hey, we don't want to be in Iraq, we don't want to be in Afghanistan. I don't know. I hear a lot of that rhetoric coming out of the Republican Party right now in the GOP, right? No more infinite wars. Like, let's not invade and try to do regime change. Which is wild, right? Freedom of speech. Well, okay. So you've almost flipped some of the talking points from the both parties, both red and blue, in the last 30 years based on the evolution of politics in America and the national conversation. So if you're holding people accountable from their previous support for name the candidate on the blue side, and you're not trying to include them on the conservative side, you're messed up. Like, we got to open up our arms and say, this is a big tent full of people that love America, and we're concerned about the direction and the future of this country. Not, okay, you got to stay in the parties that you've been in all the time. I don't think that's the way for us to move forward. And more importantly, I don't think that's the way you win, because you've got to capture what I call the purple. In the middle of red and blue, there's this big swath of purple. And that big swath of purple is a lot of the undecided and or the mixed ticket voters. And those mixed ticket voters
which are the majority.
Yeah, it's a huge majority. Yeah. So if you're being too exclusive, you're going to push them to the other side, right? And I think that's a really bad way for, I think, any party to say, well, we have to put everybody through a purity test. I think it's really bad.
And when you have Dick Cheney endorsing Kamala Harris, who's the former CEO of Halliburton, that is the biggest warmonger on the planet, now supporting Dems who are now warmongers.
Of course,
who are all about diversifying their Halliburton, name the defense contractors portfolio. It's like, what is happening?
And all of a sudden now, like, he's lauded by the Democrats that have been basically villainizing him for the last 3 decades.
Yeah.
But now he's a good guy.
Now he's
a good guy. Yeah. So, he was Satan reincarnate.
Yeah.
But now he's a good guy because he's obviously, seen the light. So that just washes the last 20 years of rhetoric. And I'm no fan. And I think the older I get, the more I realize, we spent the majority of our lives in Iraq and Afghanistan, the majority of our 20s, at least 20s and early 30s. And dude, I would have much rather like maybe done something else with my time versus
100%.
Been rotating in and out. And now I have back and neck and all kinds of different problems and sleep issues. Like, there's a lot of fly fishing and hunting I could have done in those late 20, early 30s years. Yeah. And I don't look back and I don't regret anything in the context of serving your country is one of the best things that you can do, because it also teaches you a lot, not only about yourself, but about your nation and also about the government. Right. But the fact that nobody was held accountable, like once there's no weapons of mass destruction, then the ball shifted. And then that's my other problem is there's no clear, this is the mission success criteria. This is the definition of success in Iraq. This is the definition of success in Afghanistan. And that is the single point issue that I have with Ukraine. What's the measure of success there? What is it? Well, they can't tell me. Okay, if you can't tell me what the end state is for the tax dollar, you can't get involved. That has to be the actual criteria for the expenditure of taxes. Yeah. If you can't clearly define what minimum success criteria for a U.S. taxpayer dollar that comes out of their business, out of their family, out of their ability to take, put milk in their refrigerator and take their kids on vacation and put them in better schools. If you can't define that for the taxpayer, you can't get involved, period. Because if you can define the success criteria, that means people can weigh in on whether or not they want to participate in that. But if there isn't, it's like we'll just go out and blindly support European country X or Middle Eastern country X. What that tells me is that's a transference of wealth from the taxpayer to the military industrial complex using a legal conduit called the government to do it. That's exactly what it tells me.
Yeah, I was going to say the end state there is World War III.
Yeah.
Because they want to poke and prod the Russian bear until they lob a long-range missile into Russia because we approved it. Eventually, that's going to be approved. And it has, a Boeing tag on it. It lands and drops into a Russian city, kills civilians, and then Putin says, I told you what was going to happen.
Told you.
And he launches a tactical nuke. And then our situation is, do we launch a nuke to defend Ukraine because they bombed Ukraine after they told them this is the line in the sand? And what frustrates me is, look, Trump during his 4 years, we were not, just like J.D. Vance said, we were not involved in foreign campaigns of conflict, in proxy campaigns, at least overt, during that 4 years.
Let me set the record straight on this, which is I believe in covert action. I truly
For sure.
do. I think
it's a cleaner way. It's a dirtier but cleaner way to absolve ourselves from a geopolitical nightmare.
Correct.
And when Trump committed to that, he crossed over the North Korean, South Korean border that hasn't been done since 1953 and shook hands with a dictator, and they use that as propaganda against Trump. It's like that's what a president does. He leads strength through peace, right? So if he's and it's peace through strength, but if he says, I'm going to shake your hand and I'm going to tell you behind closed doors what's up, Putin, if you get crazy, I'm going to decimate and turn your entire country into a Siberian parking lot, okay? So if he does that, he earns the respect of a former KGB officer who goes, I respect him, because that's how it's done. There's no respect for Biden. There's no respect for Harris. He won't even talk to him. They haven't even talked to the Chinese military in 3.5 years. They have no point of contact anymore. And you wonder why we're on the verge of World War III. And they want it because it's their justification for all their portfolios to go through the roof.
But I think that's the same game plan for the last several decades. So even if you look at the Cold War and you say, okay, the point of the Cold War, there's a lot of just ridiculous bullshit that went on in the Cold War. Meaning they built nuclear arsenals on both sides that could blow up the world multiple times over. In what world does this reality plane live in where you're like, well, we have a nuclear arsenal that can blow up the world 10 times.
Yeah. We're bearing ICBMs in rural
Montana. After a certain point, there's a water line. The cup is full. That's all you can fit in it. You can blow up the world. So you had multiple people within the government, not only just the president, because there's this fictional narrative out there. I said the president was the only person that had the nuclear codes in order to start World War III. Not accurate. There was multiple people within the administration and the DOD that could have unilateral decision making in order to literally press the button. Because if the president isn't available, who else makes the decision? Who else makes the decision? Who else makes the decision? So you had non-elected people within the DOD that had the unilateral decision making to launch nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union at that time. And same in the Soviet Union. And if you go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis and what was happening behind the scenes and what avoided actual conflict was RFK, which is the president's brother, negotiating withdrawal of missiles out of Turkey if they withdrew their missiles out of Cuba, quite literally behind the scenes. And then they had an outwardly facing statement. So nobody would lose face. So the Soviets didn't have to lose face. Americans didn't really have to lose face. Everybody wins, but at the end of the day, we don't have nuclear weapons parked in our backyard.
Diplomacy.
Yeah.
When it works.
But it worked because they could communicate and they could pick up a phone, they could make the right calls. But if there isn't a means in order to communicate, in order to avoid literally blowing up the world, which I think I'm obviously summarizing a huge percentage of the Cold War, but if we've learned anything from the Cold War, we had to learn that we need to keep our enemies close, right? Our friends close and our enemies closer, which is we do. We have to pull them in tight. We have to understand what their intents are. And then we have to be able to avoid conflict whenever necessary to protect innocent lives. Like we have to. That is the moral and ethical obligation of our elected official. And if they're actually failing in that, then he got to be fired. Like plain up. Like he got beat up because he brought the Taliban to a sanctuary, a sacred place of Camp David. And it's like, okay, well, Camp David, it's also, it also hosted Yasser Arafat, I believe, right? So Yasser Arafat and Israeli prime minister at the time. So somehow we have it in mainly the Democrats on their side have it in their mind that anything and every outreach that President Trump tried to make towards either a terrorist organization or a dictator is now seen as propaganda and not a good thing, even though their lauded, party kings like Clinton and Obama and Kennedy, right? They all did the same thing. They all reached out to our biggest enemy, our biggest foe, in order to avoid conflict.
Gorbachev and Reagan.
There you go.
I mean, when you look at leaders and their ability to build rapport, like we learned, likely in our special operations path as Green Berets, you go to Robin Sage and we learn about developing rapport with an auxiliary force, an indigenous force behind enemy lines, and then building rapport with that G chief and things that you have to do to break bread and build relationships. It's rapport building 101. When you take that, the reason that's so impactful on the battlefield is because you're acting as a diplomat representing a larger entity, the U.S. government, let's say, and you're speaking on behalf, but you're having conversations that have strategic implication. When you don't do that because you operate in a silo and you refuse to communicate with the world becomes chaos. We saw it with interagency organizations. I saw it where I was like, case officer, you're saying this, why don't you get your ass up and walk across to the Tactical Operations Center and just talk to the commander and let him know your intent? Well, I could do that. Like, yeah, let me hold your hand and walk you over there. Hey guys, do a face-to-face. You're 100 yards from each other in a tent in the middle of the desert. Like, why are you not having these conversations? Oh yeah, now we have rapport. Now we have all this fluidity and this ability to do all these things that we couldn't do because we had basic conversation and basic communication. Trump gets it because of his business perspective. Think about every business deal that you've made. Those deals were made not in a boardroom, not over a VTC, not on an email. They were made in a restaurant, sitting down, talking about family, talking about future, talking about the ideas that you had of the world. And that's how you built the most rapport. That's how you integrated all of these amazing relationships that are going to continue to lead to all this progression and all this amazing things that you guys are doing. This administration doesn't get that.
I think they get it. I think they do get it, but I think they're just built on two different waveplanes. I think you have quite literally, you have a professional bureaucracy. These are heads of a professional bureaucracy. That's who they are. Like when we think about how long the Biden administration and most of the Biden administration, how long they've been in government, where they've served in government, we're talking about professional bureaucracies. Yeah. So these are the heads of a professional bureaucracy versus I think you have a lot of people that are coming in from the civilian corporate sector on the other side. They're saying, we want change. And I see this as like, this is just, I think, I see this election boiling down to, this is a wrestling match between bureaucrats who want more funding, more opportunity to impact more change, and they want more taxpayer dollars, and the people, non-bureaucrats. I think this is quite literally what we're seeing play out, which is you have a group of people that identify with paying their bills through taxpayer dollars, and you have a group of people that are like hunt and kill on your own. Like, we don't need the Fed. We don't need the local government. They're there to support our, communities and our families when we need them. But that's not the way that we actually feed our families. And I mean, when we look at the federal government, how big the federal government is, it's the largest employer in the world. And there's a lot of people
continues to grow.
there's a lot of people that do incredible work. I'm not taking away from anything that they do because there's a lot of people that do incredible work there. But there has to be a tipping point where it's too big. And that's what I think
Trump's
at the
the
heart
tipping point,
of the
yeah.
conversation is. How much authority and power do we need to outsource to the bureaucracies, which requires more money? And then when do we say, okay, enough's enough? I really do think that's
Who do you think is going to win?
I think Trump's going to win. I do. But I also am like, well, if he wins, he's got to win by 5. He can't just win by 1 because I think there's just, I think when you're bribing people, essentially, I mean, it's legal gerrymandering when you have, voter registration and legal immigrants in the United States in some of these counties and you're
14
busting
states.
them in. Yeah.
You don't need an ID.
You don't need one, which is completely ridiculous, by the way. Like, okay, so you need an ID to get behind the wheel of a car and drive down the road. And if not, then you're quite possibly going to not only get a ticket, but you're going to go to jail. But to make actual change in this country, to elect people that are in the driver's seat of our nation, you don't.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I get it from an individual responsibility. There's only so much impact, which is so much impact a driver can make. But when you have a bad politician, they can make huge impact. In some ways, it's infinitely more important for that person to have a stake in the country, a legal representation of a stake in our country versus, hey, diddle diddle. Can you imagine if you didn't have to have a driver's license?
Yeah.
What would the roads look like? Chaos. That's what I think non-registration or non-registered voting looks like. Chaos.
It's crazy.
Crazy.
It's
how would you ever
discrimination.
enforce any law on the interstates? People would be driving around. They would have no clue, how to just abide by regular traffic, not even just traffic rules, not even laws. So if you're just going to allow complete chaos, which a true democracy without a democratic republic, if it's just mob rule, that's kind of what it looks like, mob rule. And especially if you don't have any, what's preventing other countries from just busing hundreds of thousands of people into the country then, and then saying, well, you know what? Mexico wants to affect our elections, so what's going to prevent them from actually busing people in and saying, you know what? We want to have more of a representation. We want to actually have a representation in Philadelphia because we feel like Mexico is underrepresented. They don't pay taxes.
Yeah.
Why would they?
Wild.
Yeah, it's wild, man.
Let's talk covert operations because I wanted to ask you this when it was going on. I was just feeling so ill. Pagers, walkie-talkies, and then strategic strikes. This is nothing new. I mean, to the world at this level, via phased national media propagated campaign, it may be new to a lot of people, but in warfare, it's always been a thing. I mean, MACV-SAW guys I've interviewed told me about how they used to sabotage ammo supplies to make them explode. I've been on operations, very specifically 3 of them, that involve that kind of thing.
It's awesome.
Super fun. And then I've actually, I've worked with the NSA on one, and it's very effective. When you look at the amount of damage they did, because they injured thousands and killed a lot of people. 17 in the second day just from pagers and a couple of the walkie-talkies. And then that led off to them detonating pagers to walkie-talkies to strategic strikes and then going ham on the entire chain of command of Hezbollah, which is completely eradicated. Which is when they have a picture of you on a whiteboard with a string drawn to another dude, you're going to die. And I've worked with Israeli operatives. I can't say very specifically the specific organization I work with.
Just do it. It's okay.
Shinbet. They're low-vis guys. But these dudes scared the shit out of me. And I was when I was told by my boss, hey man, you need to teach these guys everything you know. I was like, well, everything? It's like they have complete and utter open, all your SOPs. I'm like, okay. when I saw these dudes, I was like, these dudes look like terrorists. They look like terrorists I put in the dirt before.
Yeah.
And I was like, and I got the word of who they were and what they did. And when I saw this covert stuff happening behind the scenes, what do you think the Israelis do every single day? They're doing operational preparation of their environment. And it's all they have to do. They have more than their overt IDF dude in the uniform with a kit and a gun. Their low vis, reduced signature, covert operations profile is so robust, it will blow your mind. They're not new to this. This is nothing new.
I mean, there was, you remember this, in Coast several years ago in Afghanistan, there was a suicide bomber that, unfortunately was let in through the gate by the ill-found and completely ridiculous actions of the case officer on the ground, which I don't care. It's been long enough. I mean, the case officer that actually made the decision to bring this asset through the gate without any security protocols, she got those guys killed. Now, she was unfortunately killed in that as well. And then there are 3 guys that were killed in that suicide bomb, which I know for a fact you remember it. I was in Kabul.
Yeah.
And
Jeremy Wise was one of my buddies that I served with it. He was a SEAL. I served with him, but he was killed.
Good dude.
Well. Good dude.
I mean, I knew all those dudes because I was there in Kabul before they rolled out, and I met all those dudes. And there was a triple agent on the ground in that also was killed. So it was a Saudi. So he's a Saudi national working for the Israelis that was working in Coast. There's a book out called Triple Agent, actually.
Wow.
So he's working at the agency, like as a Saudi national, but he was really
reporting Israelis to Israelis.
Yeah. So when you think about it, and I could get it wrong. I could have gotten it wrong because it's been 10 years since I read the book, but it's a good book. But this just tells you when we were like at the height of the war on terror, we went to the Israelis like, okay, so how do you do this? Like truly, and we should have listened to them a lot more because there's lots of different ways that we could have done things in a much cleaner fashion. Like when I say this, not from, from operational sophistication, there's tons of like really sophisticated, great ops. The problem is you had a lot of people that were unqualified to work as case officers, as you and I very much know. They were just unqualified to be in the job. Like they couldn't work in the war zone. They're meant to be cocktail circuit case officers, which like, what I mean by that is like, they're meant to like, go to parties in Europe. They're not meant to like, grind dudes into dirt in the mountains of Afghanistan. Those are like totally different animals.
That's Jack Bourne.
Yeah, that's Jack Bourne. Anyway, we've gone around the horn and back. Fucking love having you here. We're in and out today. Go to Mike Glover Actual, check out Fieldcraft, check out Mike. Love you, buddy. Can't wait to have you back. Hopefully next week.
Always.